From Acres U.S.A., you are listening to the Acres U.S.A. podcast, a conversational podcast where we'll explore sustainable farming, regenerative practices, and the latest innovations in eco-agriculture with some of your favorite farmers and ranchers. I'm your host, Taylor Henry, the owner and CEO of Acres U.S.A. Welcome to the Acres U.S.A. podcast.
Good morning, everybody. As he said, I wear a lot of hats. We do grass-fed lamb and grass-fed beef on our farm, and I'm also the founder and executive director of the Farm and Ranch Freedom Alliance, which is a nonprofit that does advocacy for small farmers and sustainable farmers, basically trying to figure out how we can both keep bad laws and regulations from getting passed and start working more with the system we've got now to make changes so that our type of farming and food production is more successful and both less expensive and less of a headache to the extent that the government makes it so. I'm going to be covering sort of a range of different topics, starting with state laws, particularly focusing on cottage food and food, what's known as food freedom laws. Then we're going to hit some federal food safety regulations. And then the last piece, which I actually consider generally the most important, even though I save it for last, which is how to get involved. Because the way this works is, yes, I lobby. I go and I meet with members, staff at Congress. I meet with state legislators. But that only works if the grassroots is active. What I do is pretty much useless if grassroots doesn't get involved. But there are ways to get involved that are better uses, better ways to spend your time. And that's what we'll be talking about, how to be effective and really make the best use of the time you give to the world of policy and activism. So I'm going to start with just sort of a general statement, though, about food safety, or a very quick general discussion, because this overwhelmingly has become the topic. And anytime pretty much you go in and there's a bad regulation coming down or you're trying to get an existing bad regulation changed, at this point I'd say about 90% of the time the argument you get hit with is, but food safety. And it's hard because all food should be as safe as possible. Yep, we all agree with that. We're all on board. But there's two problems. One is recognizing there's no such thing as a no-risk food. Biologically, it's a biological system. We're biological systems. Food is a biological product. There's no such thing as food with no risk. And there's also not the statement all food should be as safe as possible is not the same as the statement of all food should be regulated the exact same way. Those are two different statements. And that may seem obvious to y'all, but it's not obvious to most of the people you talk with in the policy world. So it's a good statement to sort of emblazon in your brain and just have it be your automatic, like, yes, I agree, all food should be safe. That doesn't mean we need the same regulations for everybody. That's just the immediate response. And then you back it up. There's differences based on the biology. There's differences based on the economics, the business models, the type of food that our farmers here at Acres raise, the type of food that most of y'all in this room are raising. I know not all of you literally are farmers. Some of you are in other roles. But it's different. If it's grass-fed beef, it's got a much lower chance of having E. coli 0157 than feedlot beef. We've got studies to back that up. If it's any kind of meat and it's being processed at a small-scale processor, line speed, how many animals are processed in a plant, is directly relevant to the safety of the food. Fewer animals is a lower risk. Again, let's be clear. Please do not ever go in and say foodborne illness can't happen out of a small-scale slaughterhouse. That's not true. But if you're talking about statistics, if you're talking about levels of risk, we know higher line speeds, more animals through per hour, is a higher risk operation. So if you're a grass-fed beef or grass-fed lamb operator, taking your animal to a small-scale slaughterhouse, it's statistically far safer. That should be recognized in the regulations. That's something people who are setting policy, who are promoting small-scale food, promoting safe food, should be promoting. Oops, how did that? Okay, sorry, apparently this thing is going ahead of me. And, of course, talk about the traceability and the transparency of your operation. If you're selling either direct to consumers or within sort of a very local food chain, doesn't necessarily even have to be direct to consumer, but you're selling to a local grocer who knows you and then it stays branded with your name. So like on that grocery store shelf, it is McGeary Ranch Farms lamb. That's a traceability issue, which provides greater safety. Because if there's ever a problem, they know where to find you. Lack of traceability, lack of transparency is a food safety problem, and we've seen it again in outbreak after outbreak. So I just wanted to go over that. Again, I think all of y'all actually know those facts, but recognize most people don't. And so if you're trying to make changes in laws and regulations, you have to be the educator, and you have to be ready to be sharing this information with them so that they understand it. So I'm going to hit first cottage food laws around the country briefly. And of course, it's hard to do this somewhat for a national audience because there's so many, and they're all different. But I wanted to touch on really sort of what's the framework. Are there any folks in here who operate under a cottage food law right now? Nope? Okay. One? Okay, that works. So the idea behind this is somewhere in the 70s, 80s, it suddenly became the fashion, thanks to FDA, for states to just outright ban any food production in the home kitchen for sale. And so all of these people who were making things in their home kitchens and selling them at like local fairs, doing so illegally. And then really in the last 10 years, there are a few laws that predate that, but this is the mass. In the last 10 years, there's been this movement to bring back this idea that people should be able to make food in their home kitchens and sell it. And what's been carved out, so when I did a 2014 analysis around the country because we were working on a lawsuit in Minnesota and doing a survey of all of the cottage food laws, I found 43 states at that point had cottage food statutes, actually, that their legislatures had passed. And even some of the folks that didn't have statutes also had regulatory provisions. So what are we talking about when we talk about being able to make foods at home and sell it to people? The first issue is what type of foods. Cottage food laws overwhelmingly deal with non-potentially hazardous foods. They're now creating a new term for that. It's also starting to be referred to as time temperature controlled, non-time temperature controlled foods. The idea is it's food that doesn't have to be kept cold in order to prevent bacterial growth. That's sort of the rule of thumb. Having said that, not all shelf-stable food are going to be considered non-potentially hazardous. So canned foods that had to be acidified first in order to reach that stage are not considered non-potentially hazardous. Meat jerkies, even though, yes, they're shelf-stable, and at that point they don't need time temperature controls, not non-potentially hazardous. But most things, if it's shelf-stable, if you can just leave it on the counter and it's not going to grow bacteria, are going to fall within this non-potentially hazardous. Some states, and yes, I don't expect any of y'all to know any of this. First of all, glance for your state. And let me also give the disclaimer that was on the first slide, but I didn't say it. None of this is legal advice. Okay? I can't give you legal advice. What I can say is this is some outlines to get you started, and you need to look at what your state's law is. The two approaches that seem to happen, most states, a pretty good list of them, cover just anything that's non-potentially hazardous. It's in the cottage food law. And then you have other states that have a subset or a specific list of foods of what's allowed. And then so you're doing this in your home kitchen. You're not doing it in a commercial kitchen. Can the health department come in and do an inspection? What do you have to do? What does your home kitchen have to look like or be like? This is actually where you find the greatest variation. You have some states, such as my home state of Texas, which is you're doing it in your home kitchen. It's your business. We are not touching that with a 10-foot pole. In fact, our health departments are not allowed to even come into your home kitchen as a cottage food producer unless they can connect you to a foodborne illness outbreak. Then they can come in. If you've actually started making people sick, guess what? You're going to get inspected. But otherwise, they can't even come in. Other states, there's a bit of regulation. Here's this, here's that. Other states, it's whole hog. Pretty much you almost have to look like a commercial kitchen just in your home kitchen. There's a massive range. So I wasn't even going to try I can't categorize. I tried and I stopped. And then there's who are you selling to? So all of these laws, the primary emphasis, the primary focus of it is in direct-to-consumer sales. And this is part of the argument for these cottage food laws, is you're dealing with a relationship between the seller and the buyer. a direct relationship where if the buyer has questions or they're not certain they want to buy from someone's home kitchen, they're talking right there to the person who made the food. They want to know what's in it, they're talking right there to the person who made the food. This is that direct-to-consumer relationship is really at the heart conceptually of cottage food laws as we have them at this point. About half the states are, as long as it's direct-to-consumer, great. We don't care how you set that up. It's you, the customer, and you're done. About half of them have some restriction on location, whether that's you can sell from your home, you can sell at a farmer's market, you can sell on a roadside stand. There's something where they kind of stick their fingers into defining more what, some limitation on direct-to-consumer. I'm going to come back to the second half of this slide in a moment. I realized this morning that I hadn't wanted to link those two, so I'll come back to that. Some states have a cap on how much can be sold, generally based on dollar amounts. I'll say that. So like Texas, we have a $50,000 cap. And we set that, honestly, sort of based on the concept of how much can you do in your home kitchen? I mean, if you're talking about a normal home kitchen and you've got even a double oven, normal range, how much are you going to be able to make at home before you need better equipment anyways? That was, from the producer standpoint, how we were looking at the caps. What we talked about with policymakers on looking at the caps, and we used it to sell this, and I think it's been used in a lot of states. The states that have caps, this has become a way to help get these laws passed, it's these startup businesses that need the most help. A commercial kitchen can cost, what, $40,000, $50,000 to build a commercial kitchen? If you're starting up a business, that's a massive capital investment. Let's get rid of that startup barrier. Let people get started in these businesses in their home kitchens. If they want to stay small and just have it as a sideliner business, great, no more need. If they grow past these amounts, then they're in a position to invest in a commercial kitchen. And so what we've done with these laws, even where there's caps, and I'd prefer not to see caps. I mean, just frankly, if I had my choice to exactly, if I could dictate the terms, there wouldn't be caps on any of these laws. But it's often necessary in order to sell it, and it does make sense. It moves that startup barrier. And from a farmer's perspective, it allows, let's say, if you're farming whatever, and you just want to have a small little additional business and value added, again, you're allowed to sort of have this sideliner business without investing into a commercial kitchen. You can test. Do people also want to buy baked goods at my farmer's market booth? Do people also want to buy dried herbs to go with our meats? You can sort of try these sideliners to your main farming and ranching business without having to invest in a commercial kitchen. So that's cottage food laws in a nutshell. What I had done in this slideshow, and as I woke up this morning going, I really shouldn't have done it quite this way, is categorized cottage food laws and then went straight to what's known right now as food freedom laws. And there's really a middle tier. And I actually think that's a really important, valuable middle tier. So I'm kicking myself for how I did the slideshow. Because the cottage food laws are, as you've just seen, a very discrete. This is generally direct to consumer, non-potentially hazardous foods. From, again, a farmer's perspective, this is actually a boon for farmers markets because it brings these value-added people, and opens. And I love when I go to a farmer's market and I see cottage food producers, and it brings this energy to the market. But if you're a vegetable farmer, canned vegetables aren't on here because they're not non-potentially hazardous foods. Jams and jellies are. So, if you're raising high-acid fruits, you can at least do jams and jellies. But if you've got extra zucchini, your option under a cottage food law is going to be zucchini bread, not a canned or frozen vegetable product. For meat producers, jerky's not on here. It's a limit for the farmers and ranchers directly. And what exists in some states in a very limited fashion, and what we're hoping to work on spreading, what I think is the next wave. So remember, cottage food laws, if you'd gone 10 years ago and done that survey that I did in 2014, I think you would have found 3 or 4 states that had cottage food laws. That's been the growth of cottage food laws in the last 10 years. It's been massive. So we've had this sweep. This idea caught on. People got it through their legislatures. And now I think it's time for another sweep. Now, one option for a second sweep would be the food freedom laws, and we'll cover those in a minute. I'm not sure if that's going to become a sweep across the nation. It's not clear to me politically that is viable across the country. I think that arguably this middle tier is. So I'm going to go back to where I started talking here about wholesale grocery store sales. Because there's a mix of states. There's about half a dozen or 7 or 8 states that have what I call home processor laws. And none of them actually, I think 2 of them call it home processor laws. Some of them actually just call them cottage food laws. Some of them call it, I forget what Ohio calls it. You know, there's different names for them. And they vary, again, a lot. But there's 2 big differences between them and the cottage food laws. Some of them allow wholesale sales. So it's not limited to direct to consumer. Because if you want to try your product line and get it into the local grocer because, whatever, you don't sell at a farmer's market, you don't have good farmer's markets around, you aren't a marketing person, and the thought of selling direct to consumers makes you cringe, wholesale has a lot of value. And so there's some of the states that allow wholesale, like Ohio's cottage food law. And this is what they call cottage food law. You can sell anywhere in Ohio. As long as it's non-potentially hazardous, and the rest of it. Maine has some of this, Tennessee, Utah. Some states, like California, has actually done a 2-tier. So they've got cottage food law level A and cottage food level B. And level A is really very minimal regulation, direct-to-consumer. Level B, they start regulating you more, still in your home kitchen, and you're allowed to sell wholesale. And so you start seeing those. And again, some of them then also what I consider just as important, and for some, again, sort of it depends what your interest is. For some people, it's actually the issue, is additional types of food. Canned vegetables are allowed under some of these. Potentially hazardous foods are allowed under some of these. And so you start seeing this mix of more options traded off for some level of regulation. Generally is how this works out when you start diving into these bills. And then we get to the food freedom bills. And we have seen progress on these. My crystal ball's cloudy as trying to figure out where this goes from here. But we have seen progress. Wyoming was the very first state to pass what's being called, again, these food freedom bills in 2015. And it exempts in-state food sales from government inspections. As long as it's sold directly from a producer to they call it informed end consumer, and if I remember, I forgot to put the definition in here, but it's about like having a notification to the consumer that this was not inspected, this is produced under the Wyoming Food Freedom Bill, so that the consumer recognizes that the government isn't involved, and it is any food except meat. So you make it, you sell it, and there's no licensing, no permitting, no certification. You go have fun. That was first passed in 2015, and then in this last year they expanded it. So they were able to expand it to cover domestic rabbit meat and farm-raised fish other than catfish. We'll explain. That has to do with USDA, which we'll get into in another moment, why that had to be that narrow in adding meat. And it also did, so one of the restrictions in the original Food Freedom Bill was you couldn't sell it at the same place that you were selling normal inspected foods. Because, presumably you don't want confusion, you don't want people getting confused thinking they're buying different things. This finally does allow it to be sold at the same facility on the farm, ranch, or home. So the idea is if you have a farm or a ranch, and let's say you have meat that's processed at a state-inspected facility, and you also want to sell these other foods, how do you do both? And now what you can do is you can set up where your store with the inspected foods is here. You have a separate door, separate cash register or point of sale, and here's all of the foods being produced and sold under your Food Freedom Bill. So it allows more flexibility for people who are producing a wider range of foods.
Hey, eco-farmers. This is Taylor Henry with Acres U.S.A. I hope you enjoy this podcast as much as I enjoy interviewing these folks. If you're serious about regenerative agriculture, I've got an incredible resource you need to check out, the Acres U.S.A. membership. You farm in the physical world, and you deserve a physical printed magazine to match. Since 1971, Acres U.S.A. magazine has been the leading voice in ecological agriculture, delivering the best insights from regenerative farmers, agronomists, and researchers to help you farm profitably without toxic chemicals. Our membership included physical and digital copies of the magazine each month of the year, which has always been a standard for Acres U.S.A., but we wanted to over-deliver on content. When I acquired this business, I was happy to find that we had years of audio files from presentations at our annual EcoAg conference. And guess what? They were hiding. Well, not anymore. We developed this membership portal that gives you access to the recordings from farmers like Gabe Brown, Gary Zimmer, Joel Salatin, and Mark Shepard. We also include recordings of private events. Finally, if you are like me and you like listening to content, we are now producing a membership-only podcast of each issue of the magazine, so you can consume each article while you're out in the field. To make things even sweeter, you'll get discounts on books, workshops, and events to keep expanding your knowledge. So are you ready to take your farming to the next level? Join today for a ridiculously low price at eco-farming.com or see details in the notes.
Also this year, there was the North Dakota Food Freedom Bill that got passed. So very much similar, allows direct sales to consumers of all foods without licensing or inspection except meat or raw dairy. This one also knocked out raw dairy, partly because North Dakota already has a herd share recognition for raw dairy. So the idea was, if you're doing raw dairy, go through the herd share stuff we have. Labeling requirements, point of sale disclosure, those, by the way, are pretty standard actually for cottage foods as well. Something that tells the consumer what they're getting into. And it does involve poultry as well, up to 1,000 birds. And we're going to get into the meat processing in more detail when I hit the federal stuff. And then the last one that was passed just this year is Maine's Food Freedom Bill that was signed in June 2017. And it's a slightly different approach. Instead of saying on a statewide basis, we're going to deregulate all of this, it built on what had been happening over the past several years in Maine, where people were getting local ordinances saying, in our city, in our municipality, we're going to allow unregulated direct-to-consumer sales. And the problem for that, by the way, is local law can't override state law. Maine does have extremely strong home rule provisions. I think Maine probably has the strongest home rule provisions of any state in the country. So if it was they were going to get away with it anywhere, it would be Maine. Still not clear. So what happened was they came up with a good solution, which is, okay, let's just make sure state law then recognizes that. You know, rather than get into that long, protracted court battle and have to argue over whether the Maine home rule cities actually could do this, let's just have the state agree that the Maine home rule cities can do this, and so now they have, and municipalities can allow these unregulated direct-to-consumer. You had a question, or? So there's a general proposition called the Supremacy Clause. And the Supremacy Clause itself is in the U.S. Constitution, but it also applies sort of the way legally we interpret things, which is federal law trumps state law trumps local law. Now, if there isn't a conflict, the state can do whatever it wants. If there's not a conflict, the locals can do whatever they want. If there's an actual direct conflict and the state says you can do X or you can't do X, and local governments say you can do X, state law wins. Unfortunately, it does allow, the problem is basically it is geared towards always allowing stricter stuff. So for the most part, except when we get into federal preemption, which is a whole hour conversation by itself, what's relevant to most of us is, let's say the state says you can sell, actually most states, you can sell raw vegetables direct to consumer, or you can sell raw vegetables with no regulation. That's where most states are. A local government, county or city, generally counties have very little authority, but city could come in and say, you know what, we want to make a permit requirement for everyone selling vegetables in our city. They can ratchet up the requirements, but let's say the state has a law that says you cannot sell canned vegetables without doing it in a commercial kitchen. Your local government can't say, you know what, we're just going to say within our city you don't have to. Sort of at each level, they can ratchet up the regulations. They can't ratchet it down. And that's just a default structure for how our system works. So what Maine has done with this is you had all these local governments saying, we're going to say that local food sales in our township are unregulated. Again, they have very strong home rules, so they might have won had this come down to a big court battle, but it would have been a difficult one. And now we just have the state legislature saying, no, we aren't going to fight you over that. If you want to do it in your township, you can. Now, this bill covered all foods, as has some of these ordinances. Some of these ordinances have not exempted out meats the way Wyoming or North Dakota did. And the reason Wyoming and North Dakota did what they did is exactly what's happened here, which is in July, USDA FSIS came in and said, oh, no, you can't do this. It violates the Federal Meat Inspection Act, which goes, again, to this issue of federal law trumps state, trumps local, and threatened to basically do a finding that Maine's state meat regulations no longer met the federal requirements, which would have completely, abolished or messed up Maine state meat processing laws. And so they came in, the Maine legislature came in, and they pulled out and said municipal ordinances on meat and poultry cannot conflict with state or federal law. So effectively, it's yanked meat and poultry back out of this because that's the way it is right now under federal law with meat processing. So before that leads into the local meat, but I do want to just sort of share why I was making somewhat cryptic comments earlier about the food freedom bills. It may be that this turns into a sweep across the country. I think there's certainly some potential. There's some strengths to it. It's got a lot of appeal on just a gut level. Let's just deregulate direct-to-consumer and say we're done, At the same time, if you look at who's actually gotten it passed, Wyoming and North Dakota are states with very small populations, large agricultural, production, very conservative, very, the tradition of individual freedom and limited government is about as strong in those states as they are anywhere. It's what appeals there to their legislature may or may not fly elsewhere. Maine, of course, has a very different world of politics. They also have some of the strongest local food lobbying, state-level lobbying of any state I know. I mean, they're incredibly effective, and I give huge kudos to the Maine groups. So, it's sort of, I'm curious to see where this movement goes. And do we move to food freedom bills in more states? Or do we have to, and I say have to, let me say, I actually think there are also advantages to the slightly more nuanced, or not slightly, very much more nuanced approach of the home processors, because the disadvantage of these, and the only way I think these bills fly, is direct to consumer. I mean, I don't think you're going to get deregulation across the board of foods being sold into grocery stores. Not going to happen, and I don't think it would be a particularly bright idea. So in our movement, we have to make a decision to some extent. How much do we want to fight, and how much do we want to work for bills that are focused just on the direct-to-consumer world and say it's most important to us to have no regulation in the direct-to-consumer rule versus, we could take some regulation, but we want to have those other options into the wholesale markets. And that's going to be a different conversation in each state. That's going to be about what the producers are looking for, what the direct-to-consumer markets are like, what your legislature's like. I don't know that I certainly don't have an answer. But I think maybe some states go food freedom law route, some states go home processors law route, and we see what works best. And we make it the political experiment, which theoretically is why we have states to some extent, is to allow these sorts of political experiments. But going on to local meat, I think probably most of y'all, if not everyone, knows that your slaughter options are limited by federal law. The USDA FSIS runs the federal meat inspection program. State-inspected programs must be at least equal to federal standards. And effectively, USDA FSIS has simply said that means the exact same. Equal to is sort of the jargon for it. You have to do the same thing. You can just put a different human being as your inspector. And in some states, it is the same person. They just literally change out which badge they're carrying. There are on-farm options for poultry and rabbits. The way this works is that at the federal level, there are two levels. There's a 1,000-bird exemption that doesn't necessarily require any regulation. There's a 20,000-bird exemption that does carry requirements. And then it's up to the states as to what they want to do. Do they want to adopt some portion of this exemption? Do they want to adopt the biggest possible exemption? Do they want to adopt it more narrowly? What do they want to do? Federal law simply gives them the flexibility to decide what to do with these smaller scale on-farm operations for poultry and rabbits. And it varies by state law. Again, I started to try to do the compilation, decided that that was a ridiculous thing for me to do. There's a very good map at farmtoconsumer.org. They've got a map of poultry and what each state does. And again, I'll give the disclaimer for them. That's not legal advice. It gets you started understanding sort of broadly where your state is. You need to then go and be working with somebody who knows that state's regs. And then we have custom processors. How many folks in here have better access to a custom processor than to a state or USDA inspected one? Is custom processor closer to them? I've got one 15 minutes from my home. Makes me kind of crazy. Custom processors, you can't set, the standards are set by the states, period. Unlike the state inspected programs, and it's kind of confusing because you hear state inspected and you're like, well, that's a state program. State inspected has to be the same as federal. State regulated custom processors, the state really can choose any scope of regulation. In some states, they actually have those same standards other than not requiring an inspector on site. In other states, it's a lot lower standards. But either way they do it. But you then can't sell meat by the cut. So if an animal is taken to a custom slaughterhouse, the meat comes back to the person who owned it when the animal went in. So this is where people start doing things like 2 people buy the cow, and then it comes to them. You know, that is useful. I've done it. But it's really limited because there aren't that big of a customer world out there that wants to buy half a cow on the hoof and not be able, well, how much per pound? Can't tell you because it depends on the hanging weight. You know, how many pounds? I can give you a guesstimate. Well, what if I really hate this cut? Well, tough luck. You know, it's not a great way to be marketing your product. So there's a really nice bill out there. So this is not passed yet. It is the PRIME Act, H.R. 2657, filed by Rep. Thomas Massey and Shelley Pingree. So nice bipartisan bill with 19 co-sponsors from both parties right now. And it does in some ways for meat, for red meat, what the poultry and rabbit exemption already did. The poultry and rabbit exemption, remember, is on-farm processing for small-scale guys, and it's up to the states to decide how to interpret that. The PRIME Act does that for custom processors. It says, instead of saying that you cannot sell meat from a custom processor, we're going to say that's up to each state. And if the state wants to maintain that prohibition, they can do that. Or if the state wants to say, yes, you can take animals into a custom processor and then sell the meat to anywhere in the state, that would be okay too. Or anything pretty much in between. It's going to be up to the states to interpret it. If this is something you care about and you want to be active on, which I'd encourage, I think it's a lovely bill, I would strongly advise emphasizing the ability of the states to set their rules, both because that genuinely is the intent. That is why Massey wrote the bill the way he did, and because it's pretty important from a food safety and for people who are concerned about, like, what does deregulation mean? Because I've talked to plenty of people, legislators, about this bill, and they're like, oh, my God, but what if there's not good standards and, you know, we're going to have foodborne out. We can deal with that in the state legislature. You know, let's talk about what are the conditions in the state and what our state wants to do. For right now, all we're trying to do with this bill is create some possible flexibility so we can have that discussion at the state level. You know, and hey, if we're one of the state, if there's a state that has already a really robust state inspection program and there's good access to slaughterhouses, we'll never implement the PRIME Act. You know, let's look at what's needed in that state. And I think that message needs to be reinforced because they need to recognize all we're doing is pulling out this prohibition so that the discussion can be had on a much more nuanced, state-specific basis about what that state needs. Any questions on the meat side before I switch to veggies? Okay. So it's actually not just veggies. So how many people in here have heard about the Food Safety Modernization Act? Not enough of you. That was a better showing of hands than on previous topics. But the problem is anyone who produces food needs to know about this thing. And we've done a series of articles in Acres about it. We've been talking about it since 2010. And I think, honestly, that's part of the problem. We've been talking about this since 2010. And so first it was the debate in Congress, and we're fighting it in Congress, and then Congress passed it, and then we had debates all through the rulemaking, and there was 2 rounds of rulemaking. And so I do think that a lot of folks have been like, okay, we've heard you tell us it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. Okay, we're done saying that. It's here. The regulations are in place. The compliance dates are happening. Whoops. The compliance dates are already happening, though not for small-scale producers. Small-scale producers do have additional time. And this is something everybody needs to understand, including those who are exempt because of the exemptions we fought for. Because there are still things you need to be paying attention to as an exempt producer. So there's 3 main rules under it. There's actually 7 rules, but these are sort of the 3 biggest substantive ones. One is the rule for human food facilities. It's current good manufacturing practices and hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. Animal food facilities has the exact same thing, only for animal foods. And then there's standards for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce for human consumption. So I'm going to hit the produce safety rule first. And I realize in some ways I think this was labeled, food freedom, and FSMA is not about food freedom. So sorry to tell you. But it's something I think everyone needs to know. And there actually are opportunities, and we'll talk at the end of this section about where the opportunities are for change and how we might make this less of a nightmare for everybody. So the produce safety rule addresses how farms raise fruits, vegetables, mushrooms, nuts, and sprouts. I hate to break it to you, those of you who raise sprouts, in case you hadn't figured this out already, you're in the bullseye target. FDA does not like sprouts. And the FSMA rule for sprouts really reflects that. It covers buildings, equipment, employee training, pretty much everything you can imagine at all related to how you grow any produce is covered in this rule. And the estimated cost for a small farm is $25,000 per year. That's FDA's estimate, not mine. I actually would put it higher. This is not cheap. So here's the good news, and this is the part that is already a little bit, quote, food freedom, or at least not disaster. Which is there are exemptions. Personal use, of course, I just put that in there to remind people. This is an odd thing that they put in for produce that's rarely consumed raw. Because the idea is if people are going to cook it, then we aren't going to worry if it gets contaminated with salmonella. But the really odd thing about it is what they chose to put on here. So some of it makes sense to me, I understand, but I eat dill all the time, raw. Figs, yep. Peppermint, yep. These are things all the time that people eat raw. Guess what? Suspend all common sense and all personal experience. This is FDA's list. They have decreed that these foods are rarely consumed raw, and therefore that if you're growing these foods, you don't need to worry about FSMA. The new FSMA regulations don't apply to you. Be glad if you happen to fall in that category. Just, be glad and be grateful. Pecans are on there. Most nuts aren't, but pecans are. So one of my pecan orchards is like, thanking the gods that FDA decided that pecans were rarely eaten raw.
Hello everybody, this year marks a milestone, the 50th annual Acres U.S.A. EcoAg Conference and Trade Show, happening December 1st through the 4th, 2025 in Madison, Wisconsin. For 5 decades, this event has been the nation's premier gathering for farmers, ranchers, researchers, and industry leaders who believe in building soil health, resilient farm systems, and thriving rural economies. Join us for 4 days of expert-led workshops, dynamic keynote sessions, and the largest EcoAg trade show in the country. All designed to give you the tools and connections you need to grow smarter and farm with a purpose. This year's lineup includes innovators like Gabe Brown, Joel Salatin, Rick Clark, Neil Kinsey, Dr. James White, Dr. Don Huber, Helen Attow, Dan Kittredge, Will Harris, Aaron Silva, Dr. Nasha Winters, and many, many more. Don't miss your chance to be part of this historic 50th anniversary celebration at EcoAg 2025. Register today at the link in the bio.
That's one thing. The other thing is if you sell $25,000 or less of produce annually, and that's just focused on produce. So again, I think there's a fair number of folks who do sideliners. I'm among them. Our main product is grass-fed lamb and beef. We've got a small orchard. We sell nowhere near $25,000 worth of fruit a year. Our main thing is our livestock. We don't have to worry about FSMA for our produce as long as we stay under that. It doesn't matter how much we sell of meat. Total produce, yeah. So that is total produce. And if you fall under one of those two, then you're just out of FSMA for the produce rule. We'll talk about the manufacturing rule in a minute. And you don't need to worry. Mm-hmm. So if it ever came down to it, and that's a good question, and I was, on the next slide is particularly relevant. You don't have to affirmatively go to them and file anything, but if a question ever comes up, you need to be prepared to prove it. You can't just sort of make that and be like, ha, take my word for it. So, record, document, anyone who is exempt, and there's another slide with even more record keeping about exempt. Anyone who is exempt needs to be keeping those records so that if the question ever came up. I think it's phrased as all produce. But I'm not sure, actually. If you want, email me. So, by the way, I left on the back where the water is and on one of the chairs we have trifolds for FARFA, and I have business cards I can hand people. Drop me an email, and I'll double-check that when I get home because I'm not positive. This thing keeps going ahead of me. I must have a timer in there. So then there's also partial exemptions, and again, this is where record keeping becomes even more important. We fought for what's known as the Tester-Hagen exemption. That's what we call it, at least, for Senators Tester and Hagen, who were the ones that filed it. They call it the qualified producer exemption, is what FDA has termed it. And this is for anyone who sells less than $500,000 annually of all food. So unlike the $25,000 of produce, this covers all food that you're selling. And more than half of what you sell, the food you sell, goes to either individual consumers or restaurants and retailers within the same state or within 275 miles of your farm. This is what happens when you try to have a discussion in Congress, is when you say, we should exempt local producers, and they're like, what does that mean? And you go, that's a darn good question. And you try coming up with a rule that makes sense somehow for Maine, Texas, California, and Montana. Because really, what's local in all of those? That was what it came down to. This was someone 275 miles. No, it couldn't be 300. At one point it was 150. At one point it was 400. By the way, Consumers Union wanted the cash cap to be 10,000 gross sales. Small. What's a small direct marketing farm? This is what we negotiated. So this is something I was having a conversation with someone at our booth. You're going to have to do some hard thinking about. The compliance deadlines are still for small farms are still a couple of years off. If you fit within this, awesome. You need to keep records, so you need to be able to be prepared to prove that you meet this exemption. Give me one sec. And, by the way, you also there is signage requirements. So you have to have either on the label or a sign at the point of sale saying there's specific language. My brain just went blank on it. Mm-hmm. You have to meet both. You have to meet both. Now, the conversation I was having with somebody at my booth earlier is, let's say you're under $500,000, but you're not direct marketing. You're doing a lot into, the wholesale world chain. You're going to have to do some hard decisions over the next 2 years. You're either going to have to figure out how you're going to come into compliance with the FSMA requirements, or you're going to need to change your business model. And what I would strongly suggest, there are trainings being offered on FSMA compliance. And actually, if you're subject and you have to comply with the rule, you have to take that training. That's one of the requirements. Go get the training. It's 1 day. It'll make your head explode. It's usually not too expensive because it's being subsidized by FDA. Do that because A, if you are subject to FSMA, you have to. And B, do it now because you need to figure out now is that the road you're going to go down? Are you going to become FSMA compliant, or are you going to overhaul your business to fit within Tester-Hagen? And I realize that is not a food freedom call, and I am sorry. It was the best we could do. And this is what we got. And it was an amazing battle to get this much. And it's a pretty good carve-out. But it's not perfect. And you have to decide what you're going to do. But record keeping, regardless. Yes. So one thing is you have to have record keeping of your gross sales, which hopefully you are for your Schedule F anyways. But I say that, I run into farmers who don't always keep records at all. So you, first of all, if you need some documentation that would show that everything's going direct to consumer, you actually have a very easy model. If literally your model is CSA, then you just keep a record showing that basically that is your model, and 100% of your sales, therefore, by definition, are direct to consumer. Direct to consumer is direct to consumer. It's not limited to that. So, for instance, let me take a more typical thing. Someone sells at a farmer's market, then they also sell a bit to restaurants, and they also sell a little bit into the local wholesaler because they've got extra zucchini at different times of the year. So, that sort of thing, what you want is to have some record at the farmer's market of how much you sold. So it could be a simple, at our farmer's market, when we sell, we just keep a running total. Like, we sold 5 pounds of this, here's what we charge, bump, bump, bump. If you don't do it that way, you need something that says at the end of the day, we sold 700, 1,500, whatever it is, at the Mueller Farmers Market on this date. All of that was direct to consumer. You don't need those people's addresses. You don't need their names. You do need something that documents that X amount of sales went direct to consumer. If you're selling to a restaurant or a retailer, you're going to need their name and their address because you're going to need to be able to count them towards this. So you'll have your invoice to the restaurant. I sold it to Daidui, X amount of, $700 worth of produce on such and such a date. Thank you. Here's Daidui's address. Done. And then you'll keep records of your wholesale sales in that sort of same way. And then you're just going to need to literally do the math. And for some of you, it'll be super easy because you know that well over half of your sales are going to be direct. Others, you need to crunch those numbers and make sure that you're staying above that 50.1% mark. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to rush through the next two because A, they're really complicated, and B, we're running low on time, and I don't want to miss the last portion. So let me say, actually, we've got flowcharts, and I'm happy to consult with people as well. So we have flowcharts on our website, farmandranchfreedom.org/FSMA. They help walk you through figuring out if you fall within an exemption or what it takes to fall within an exemption. And if you're a member, now we are limiting it to members only in terms of individual consultations. That's a member benefit. Yes, it is. So that's exactly. So they're different. They're different. So there's growing produce, and it's untouched produce. You harvested it, you can clean it, you can bag it, and that's it for what you can do for produce. The minute you do anything more than that with your produce, or the minute you do any kind of value added, any kind of anything, and this covers also people who aren't farmers. It covers anybody who buys your produce and goes and makes value added products with it. It's a facility issue. It's any group that any establishment that manufactures, processes, packs, or holds food. So it's store, warehousing even. There then are bunches of exemptions. The two most important are retail food establishments whose primary purpose is to sell directly to individual consumers. So do I have a light on this thing? Yes. So where this was selling more than half to individual consumers and or all of these sort of value, one step removed, this is just to individual consumers. So CSA, if you're selling more than half direct to consumers, although this isn't produce, you're doing value-added products, but you include value-added in your CSA. But again, 100% of it's going direct to consumer. You're going to be a retail food establishment and exempt. There then is also a $1 million gross sales exemption, but it's only a partial exemption, and there's still things you have to do. And then there are these exemptions about sort of what type of manufacturing, and they have actually like an 8-page thing of sort of low-risk manufacturing being done on low-risk foods. No way I can cover it here. Look at the flow chart. Come talk to me. If you're a member, we'll do an individual consult and help you figure out what's going on with your, with your business and what there is. Because what I want to talk about is getting involved. I want to take these last 5-10 minutes and not miss this. And let me start first by talking specifically about options for FSMA before we talk generally about activism. So, FSMA was this fight that started actually 2009. The final rules were issued in 2016. We're starting to see compliance dates. It's been a very long process. The good news is it might become a longer process because the FDA is at least considering some changes. So there was one issue that got left open by FDA to begin with, which is the issue of how to deal with what they call biological soil amendments, and we call things like compost and compost tea and vermicompost and manure and all these lovely things for organic farming. And they initially had proposed some very draconian rules, and we and many others raised a stink about it. And they said, you know what, we're going to go look at this, we're going to study it for the next 5 years, and then we'll issue rules on it. So that's hanging out there. We're sort of in that 5-year period where they're supposed to be looking at this, trying to figure out the science. There's actually, I'm going to a meeting next week that where they're talking about like what's their current status on their thinking. So unfortunately, because of the timing, I can't tell you squat. I have no idea what they're thinking. I will know more after next week and be reporting back on that. But that's a really important area because the rules they initially proposed treated anything other than thermally heated compost as if it was raw manure. So static compost, vermicompost, compost tea with any kind of additive, you put molasses in your compost tea, all would have been treated as if they were just as risky as raw manure. And there would have been a 9-month waiting period between application and harvest, which effectively means you aren't going to use them unless you've got fallow fields. It knocks them out. That was not adopted. Again, let's note, not adopted, not what they've done yet, but it's what we know their starting point was, which is a really disastrous starting point. So that's open. That's going to be happening over the next couple of years, and it's pretty vital. And once we know a bit more about where FDA is thinking now, like after next week's meeting, we'll be able to give better guidance on how people can be communicating about that. Because we need to make sure they don't come out with something that's anywhere close to what their initial proposed rule is. That area was left open purposefully. Email alerts and membership with us. I don't know of any. They do technically have, FDA does post things, but usually by the time they've posted them, it's already sort of later than it's useful. So that's that. The other area, so that was left open by FDA, announced specifically. Now, they did go ahead and issue final rules on water, which are some of the worst among their produce safety rules, the requirements for how much water testing you have to do and the standards that have to be met. And by the way, this is one of the few places where we weren't the only ones complaining. The conventional ag people are really upset about it. In fact, quite possibly more upset than we are about it. And so the FDA has announced that they're going back and looking at that again. So it is in the rule. It's there. They've already delayed the compliance deadline, so nobody's having to comply with that yet. And they've announced, we're taking a second look at it. Now, again, it's not completely clear how we get our noses into that discussion, and we need to get involved, and we're working on figuring that out. But that's there. The other is it's a Farm Bill year coming up. And the Farm Bill is a Christmas tree. All sorts of things get hung onto it. Lots and lots of little ornaments. So it's a good place to try to handle amendments to things. Again, there's some muttering. It's not quite clear where this is going to go. But the Farm Bill would be a really nice place to try to roll back some of FSMA. Now, before anyone gets their expectations too high, FSMA is not going away. We're not getting rid of this whole thing. It's not going to happen. But it could be a place to deal with the water issues, to deal with the compost issues. It might be a place to try to increase the exemption and make it a larger exemption. There are things that could be tried with the Farm Bill as a vehicle. So having depressed everybody in a talk that was supposed to be about food freedom by talking about FSMA, the story's not over yet. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I know where you're going, and tuber stuff is fascinating on that. We can't go there when we're working on the policy level because it's too complicated and too nuanced, and we'd first have to educate the legislators and the regulators and get them to accept that manure from a conventionally fed cow carries X risks and manure from an organically fed cow carries Y risks. And then what that means then to soil health and what that then means to food safety. You know, that's a 10-year project, and I think it's worth starting there. So let me say, I'm sort of cutting you off because we only have 5 minutes left, but talking about policy in general, and I'll lead into the general policy discussion. That sort of thing, there are things you look at as long-term goals, and educating legislators on that level of complexity is a long-term goal. It is not going to work to try to deal with it in FSMA. Please, and just accept that for me for now so that I can finish. But it may not be. It may not be as good as it would be if it weren't organic. If it were organic, but no, I don't think that using compost to fertilize the crops creates a significant food safety risk more than chemical synthetic. I mean, let's also talk about this. We're talking about the difference between doing that and chemical synthetic agriculture. I don't think they need to be regulating, creating a 9-month waiting period just because there was glyphosate that was fed to the animal that produced that manure. And I've seen Huber stuff about there's a difference in. Well, if that's the case, then what we're dealing, because let's face it, most organic farmers are also using manure from conventionally fed animals because there's not enough. So if you're talking about banning not only manure but all compost, and if that really were that dangerous. Now, again, there's health issues. There's micronutrients. There's issues of the chelating and binding micronutrients. But we are talking about foodborne illness. We are talking about E. coli 0157, salmonella, and the rest. And actually, I haven't seen him producing, and I may have missed it, something that says that 6 months later, after it's been composted, that there's still a significant risk of salmonella out of that compost. There's less nutrients. There's an impact on soil microbiology. There's lots of things that are serious from a health perspective. We're not talking about optimal health. We are talking about preventing salmonella, E. coli 157, those pathogenic bacteria that cause foodborne illness. And that is important. And this actually, that does go, and I see the question. I really want to go here, but that is important because part of this is recognizing that when you're working on policy issues and you're working on making changes, it has to be to discrete issues. You are not, there's two conversations to be had. It's great to have your legislator or their staff come talk with you about like the big picture, and you want them to understand the embrace of food that is optimally healthy, that is creating best soil health, that is creating the best environment, all of these things that we bring to the table. Because that's an awesome story, a real story. I don't mean it's story in the way it can come across. That's an amazing goal that we have here and that we're living every day as the type of producers who are here. So that story is important. But they're not going to make policy change that suddenly makes based on that. What's the policy change? What we are looking for when we're talking about statutory and policy change are discrete individual things. And we have to recognize that because they need a solution. They need to know what's the problem, why they should care about it, and what can they do about it. And the answer of that last one, you have to have identified a specific action item, not the global picture. Why they should care about it can be somewhat the global picture. So, but I think we're able to sort of, I can stick around for a while after this, but we are being told to like wrap up on time. But I can then stick around and just talk with folks. One thing to recognize about getting involved and what it means to make change is it's about relationships. So if someone on the street randomly walks up to you and tells you you should care about X, how likely are you to care about X? You're far more likely from someone you know. You've worked with them, you've talked with them, you know where they're coming from. Even if you disagree with them, you know them. This is human nature, and legislators and their staff are human beings. Newsflash, they are human beings. They don't like being yelled at. They don't particularly listen to people they don't know. This is the reality. So it's all about relationships, and there's a lot of levels. One is a lobbyist friend of mine. I'm stealing his phrase. He's like, start stalking them on social media. This does not mean the creepy version of stalking. But friend them on Facebook, follow them on Twitter, whatever your social media vice is. Yes, whatever. Mine is Facebook. I can't stand Twitter. Follow them. Get to know them on social media. Get to see what they talk about, what they care about, how do they message things, and find something you like. Now, they may be on the opposite end of the political spectrum from you, whatever. They're going to post something that you agree with. Really, they will. Like it, love it, comment on it, share it. Give them the chance to see that there is a common ground with you, even if you disagree on 90% of everything else. Because guess what? They'll notice that. These guys have egos. They like being liked. You don't run for office if you don't like being liked. Literally. So they pay attention, and their staff pays attention. And if you comment on a couple of their posts in positive ways, your name's going to become familiar to them. And then you pick up the phone and you call them. Hi, I'm Judith McGeary. I'm a constituent. I'd really like to talk with you about X. Ideally, you do this long before you see an action alert from me or anybody else saying, tell them to vote yes or tell them to vote no. You want to do this while there's a chance to build it as a relationship. Even better, set up a meeting with them or their staff. In-person meetings are worth their weight in gold in the world of policy activism because you relate completely differently to someone once you've met them. Again, we all do it. They need to know who you are. They need to understand where you're coming from. And that is the best way to communicate your passion and your dedication to this cause. That you're not going to forget about it next week because those auto emails, how many of us have clicked on the little red button to send an email message to our legislator and then never thought about that issue again? Come on. And they know that. So why should they care because you've sent them an auto email? You go meet with them or invite them to your farm and they realize this is your life's passion, that lends a whole different weight by orders of magnitude to how much attention they pay to what you say when you pick up the phone and say, I want you to vote no on X or I want you to vote yes on X. Completely different. So take the time and start building those relationships and do it whatever you're comfortable at. Do it with your congressman, do it with your state legislator, do it with your city councilman. Whatever level you want to, do it. You know, there are different issues happening at different levels. The important thing is you start that process and you build that relationship, and then you're going to be, again, orders of magnitude more effective when you want something done at that level. We have a lot more info on that. It's something I work on a lot. We teach workshops on it because the reality is none of us have been trained to learn how to be effective. And what we have been told and by the powers that be that want us to believe this is we can't fight money. That the legislators don't listen to us. They don't care what we have to say. They only care what the lobbyists say. And yes, there's a handful of really corrupt ones out there where that really is completely 100% true. But for the most part, it's not. And yes, there's a reality of going up against big money interests, and there's a reality of going up against the conventional paradigm, and it's not easy. I get my butt kicked on a regular basis. But we also win sometimes. And the way you win is by refusing to accept that paradigm, not by yelling and not by screaming, but by recognizing the work that has to go in before the crisis point, before the bill's getting voted on, and building that relationship and building that strength. So I'll stick around for about 15 minutes here, and then we've got a booth for FARFA, and I'll be there all today and tomorrow. Thank y'all.
Thank you for listening to the Acres USA podcast, a podcast production of Acres USA. Find us on Spotify, Apple, Google Play, and other popular podcast platforms. Acres USA is North America's oldest publisher on production-scale organic and regenerative farming. For more than 50 years, our mission has been to help farmers, ranchers, and market gardeners grow food profitably, regeneratively, and with nature in mind. Find our books and other Acres USA media and learn about Acres USA events at acresusa.com. Read our online magazine at members.acresusa.com, and we'd like to thank Acres USA staff for their contributions to producing this podcast. This episode was edited and engineered by Weston Larson of Acres USA. We're grateful to our guests for taking the time to talk with us about their experiences.